We are here to talk about what used to be our quarterly internet security report, but is now our biannual security report, which we'll talk about in a second. But first, let me introduce myself. I'm Corey Nachreiner, the CSO or CISO, whichever you prefer, of WatchGuard Technologies. And with me today is Marc, who I'll let introduce himself.
Yeah, hey everyone, thanks for taking time out of your day to hop on here. I'm Marc Laliberte, I'm the Director of Security Operations. So while Corey attends all the meetings, me and my team do all the work here at WatchGuard.
Whatever.
This report is, it used to just be the Marc and Corey show when we started it. Man, how long ago was it? Like 8, 9 years ago, it feels like?
Maybe more, a long time.
But now, thankfully, we have help from the rest of the team. Pulling together and analyzing the data we get from WatchGuard fireboxes deployed around the world and EPDR and 8360 installations all around the world. We definitely would not be able to get this done without our co-authors and help from many more, even outside our team at WatchGuard. But with that, Corey, you want to get us rolling?
Yeah. So the first thing I want to mention is you might notice this is now a have to instead of quarter 3 or 4 report, because we have moved our cadence for the Internet Security Report from every quarter to biannual, twice a year. There's a lot of reasons we did this, but really we noticed that the data quarter to quarter was not always changing much in certain areas. So the shift was designed to kind of give us a broader view. Instead of seeing short bursts of volatility, looking at longer stretches of data may kind of broaden the view and allow us to see the trends that matter the most. But the other side effect is, while we love the data that we share in the Internet Security Report, this does free up the Threat Lab team, the WatchGuard Threat Lab team, which me and Marc are running, to do more pointed security research projects when we have a chance to. So in the future, you may see us release like one-off reports that are very specific subjects. And of course, we'll do webinars on those as well when we do. So that is the change, and we'll share how the data changed. But with that, why don't you go through our agenda today, Marc?
Yeah, so today we're going to start off with an overview of what we call the Firebox feed, which for those that have been on here before, this isn't news to you, but for the new attendees, this is our collection of opt-in threat telemetry that we get from fireboxes deployed around the world. If you manage a WatchGuard Firebox security appliance under the general settings or the global settings, depending on which UI you use to manage it, there's a little checkbox for sending device feedback back to WatchGuard. And on newer firmware versions, there's one specifically for just threat telemetry. If you check that checkbox, anytime your device detects a threat from any of our anti-malware services or the network intrusion prevention service, it sends some anonymized information about that detection back to us so that we can collect it all together and have a view of exactly what is impacting our customers around the world when it comes to security threats. So the start of the report always focuses on these layers of anti-malware and the intrusion prevention service, as well as our DNS watch, DNS firewalling service, where we'll go into a few specific attack trends that we saw in the second half of the year. After that, we move beyond the perimeter and into the endpoint, where we look at threat telemetry from our WatchGuard EPDR and old legacy Panda 8360 installations around the world too, where we get a totally different view from what we see at the perimeter. Often at the perimeter, you'll see we're catching droppers and stagers. At the endpoint, we often see the true endgame threat, as well as what attackers are doing to try and kick off their attacks on these endpoints. So it's a different view of similar threats, and always really interesting seeing how they compare and contrast as well. And then we end, after going through all of those trends that we saw from the second half of the year, with some good tips you can take back to your organizations to defend against what we're seeing this year and leading into next year. Because it's not good enough just to scare you. We want to make sure you're leaving feeling confident and defending against what's out there. Cool.
With that, let's transition straight to the Firebox feed. And I think you'll kick it off. You've kind of explained a bit, but go ahead and explain a bit more.
So the Firebox feed, it's that collection of telemetry from all of our devices, and it's built off of 3 layers of anti-malware services. So we've got our legacy signature-based gateway antivirus service, which does a really good job of quickly catching the noise out there, the known threats. But it is a signature-based service. And so if it's a highly evasive payload, which as you'll see, a lot of malware is these days, or just a brand new type of threat, it doesn't always have the capabilities to catch those types of detections. So that's why it's backed up by two other layers of anti-malware. We've got intelligent AV, which is our AI-powered or machine learning based antivirus engine, where it also does a great job of quickly predicting whether something's going to be malicious or not based off of our trained machine learning models. And then behind that, we've got our APT blocker, which is a behavioral sandbox-based engine where we take that payload, send it up into the cloud, detonate it, and watch the actual behaviors of it to accurately flag whether it's malicious or not. Because at the end of the day, all malware is going to do something bad. And if you can catch those behaviors, you can stop the threat, regardless of if it has a signature or not. Beyond the anti-malware services, we also look at the intrusion protection service, which is a signature-based network exploit detection service. It's really interesting where it catches threats not only against exposed web applications out there on the internet. Say if you've got a WatchGuard firebox in front of your website, you can catch potential threats against that, but it also catches attacks against mobile clients. So as your web browser is browsing across the internet, if you come across a drive-by download website, it can catch that potential exploit against your client. And then also just any network connected application out there. We sometimes see threats against like Dropbox or other file sharing services or other just non-traditional network connected applications that you still want to protect as you're either exposing them to the internet or using them to navigate the internet. And then finally, the last layer is our DNS Watch DNS firewalling service, where it acts at the domain resolution layer, where we can catch things like malware command and control, phishing attacks, and other DNS-based threats really quickly early in the attack chain. And it gives us another really interesting view of just overall trends impacting protected clients around the world. But with that, let's go ahead and kick it off by diving
Well, before I
into
kick it off, I do want to mention a little bit. This is more kind of marketing to let you know about our Firebox. Do know that our report includes these 4-5 services, but there's a lot of other great security services on the Firebox, things like email protections and proxies, anti-spam application control, a botnet feed, and then at least a couple, if not a handful more that I'm not naming. So just to let you know, this does not represent all the services we have on our Firebox, but it's the ones that we get the most interesting threat data from. But with that, let's go ahead and move to the highlights, Marc.
Yeah. So first off, like Corey mentioned at the start of this webinar, this is our first time transitioning to a half of the year view, which also means as we're looking across a wider set of data, as we've got more devices reporting in over that time period, more detections become statistically relevant for us. We actually do some statistical analysis to determine and like exclude outliers to make sure they don't affect what we're reporting on. And so you'll notice if you've been a frequenter to these webinars or you're one of the people that actually reads through our report start to finish every quarter, that Q3 plus Q4 doesn't necessarily equal half two in some cases, just because of the data that we have available over that. But looking back, we also compared to the first half of the year. So we redid our data analysis partially for Q1 and Q2 to combine them using that same model that we had for the second half of the year, so we can still get that trend over time.
The half one comparison versus the half two.
Exactly. So starting with the second half of the year, though, on average, fireboxes around the world detected a bit over 1,200 malware events per device, which is a pretty sizable number, and it's actually up about 26% from the first half of the year too. This means that if you've got a WatchGuard firebox protecting your network or protecting some workloads, you're seeing over 1,000 malware events over the course of half of a year, which is a massive number of threats. And this was fueled mostly by a pretty sizable increase in basic malware detections. It was up around 89% over the period to 978 detections per device. We actually saw a slight drop, actually a pretty sizable drop in one of our evasive malware detection tools, Intelligent AV, went down by about 50% from the first half of the year to just 188 detections per device. APT blocker dropped just a little bit to 94 detections per device, which is still a pretty big number for evasive threats. But interestingly, when we look beyond just these high-level trends and look into a few specific areas, like threats arriving over encrypted connections, we still see pretty big surges in evasive threat detections. In fact, 90% or 96% of all the threats that we saw in the second half of the year arrived over a encrypted connection. And unfortunately, only a small fraction of WatchGuard's customers actually use HTTPS inspection to catch those threats at the network perimeter. And we'll get into a little bit of that a bit later too. When we
I'm
look
going to do a
at evasive,
little, oh, sorry,
yeah,
finish
please.
first. Finish first.
Last bit, so evasive malware, even though it was down a little bit for this quarter, it surged quite a bit, like 2,000% when looking just over threats arriving over encrypted connections. But go ahead, Corey.
Yeah, I wanted to, while we're talking about these numbers, all these numbers you see are per firebox, which is a change we made a few years ago. But hopefully Marc can tell me that I'm actually showing the report right now.
You
One
are,
of the
but
numbers
a bit tiny.
I do, excuse me if I can, I'm going to go to a single page to make it easier again. One of the things that we have in the executive summary is, out of curiosity, you might want to know how much malware we're really detecting. So we do this extrapolation of, Marc mentioned you have to have certain phone home things turned on for us to get this information. And on average, this comes from about 30 to 50 some thousand fireboxes, but we have a lot more out there. And if you multiply basically how many active, not even the fireboxes out there that are not active, but how many active fireboxes out there, that basically 1,200 malware blocks per firebox becomes, more than 500 million. So I just wanted to show, we show these per firebox numbers so that you as a partner or a customer, as an individual, can kind of understand how many threats one of your fireboxes are blocking. But on a global scale, it is a lot. And while we're here, Marc was citing some of the interesting numbers. One of the big takeaways of this report was seeing a surge in encrypted malware on the network, which you mentioned the 2,000%. But we also saw big surges in total malware on the endpoint as well. But I will go back to the report now and get back. You're seeing the right screen, Marc?
Yeah.
I'll get back to one of the other things we cite, which you might have thought about when Marc was talking about both intelligent AV and APT blocker being down. As Marc mentioned earlier, both of those malware services are what I call proactive malware detection. They don't need humans or patterns or signatures to figure out if something is malware. IV, as mentioned, uses machine learning or AI modeling to try to catch new threats proactively. And APT blocker is behavioral. It literally executes and watches for behaviors that malware can't really hide. So one of the trends we have, by the way, I wish it said zero-day malware on this slide, because I don't want you to get this confused with zero-day exploits or software vulnerabilities. But zero-day malware specifically is a term we made for something that is malware that a signature did not block. There was no current signature for it, so there was no known pattern for it. So it required one of the more proactive services to catch. And this is a very interesting stat we've been tracking forever. And you can see zero-day malware is rather low this quarter. Only 23% of all malware detected was detected with the proactive services. And what's even more unusual is Marc did mention we're detecting a lot of malware through encryption, TLS. But in this case, usually we see more zero-day in the encrypted traffic. We saw even less zero-day detections in the encrypted traffic. So this is unusual. I wish we could describe this. I will say it has gone down to this level before. If I were to go over the history, let's say we've been doing the report 9 years, like Marc was mentioning, I would say the first 6 years of it, zero-day malware was always around 50% and sometimes climbing to 70 or above. But about 2 years ago, we did see some of those detections start dropping. But what is interesting, in Q1 and Q2 of this year, the first half of the year, zero-day malware made a climb back to almost the opposite of this chart, almost 77%. So seeing it drop down to a low amount for the second half of the year is unusual. Obviously, as security malware researchers, we'd love to know what's happening on the threat actor side to change this, but it's hard to say. We can just see the detection actions that are happening, we can't necessarily always tie them to actions attackers are taking. But for whatever reason, this quarter, plain old gateway antivirus saw a lot of noisy malware and detected most of the malware itself.
So moving on then to the top threats by volume. So when you go through the report, you'll notice in each of the sections, we look at different slices of the data. One of the first ones we highlight is just what threat detections generated the most raw detections overall. Now, this could be heavily weighted towards like specific regions or even specific networks or potential victims versus the most widespread that we'll talk about in just a little bit. But it's still an interesting view to look at just what are attackers doing the most of over the course of the period. And you'll notice like one thing stands out that droppers were king, and that is generally the case in most of our reports. Where at the network perimeter, we're often catching that very first stage of a malware attack. And most modern malware is multi-staged, where the very first thing they do is they put a dropper on the endpoint, maybe scope out information about it, like the type of operating system, the version, might have like other components like info stealers in it to try and get information off the device. But its whole job is just to figure out the lay of the land before grabbing more pinpoint malware threats sometime later, like an actual standalone info stealer, a remote access Trojan, or a ransomware payload to act as the coup de grace at the very end of it. So 6 of the 10 threats that we saw in the top by volume were malware droppers. There were a few other interesting standouts in here. InPacket came at number 6. This is a really popular Python scripting library used by red team penetration testers and threat actors for different activities like credential dumping or remote code execution or authentication relay attacks. It's a really
I
powerful
could pop
tool.
in, by the way. Oh, sorry, sorry, you're finishing on it. How it's a cool hack tool, but in a way, it kind of it goes with the dropper and stager story. A script is often a living off the land technique that's designed to later on download other stages. So while this InPacket tool is a very specific Python, exploit framework, or I believe, the fact that it's a script kind of matches what we would expect to see in network malware.
Yep, exactly. And beyond that, there were a couple of Linux-based hacking tools that are primarily designed to find and infect IoT devices or consumer network equipment that are running Linux to turn them into botnets, to then use them for denial of service attacks or use them as proxies for other attacks against other organizations. We
What I
also
was thinking
saw,
when I saw that, Mark, by the way, is the same thing. In this case, the hack tool is maybe a final stage, but why are we seeing that on the network level? These Linux hack tools are usually designed to attack the network device itself, not necessarily it's not an endpoint Linux machine. It's not like endpoint malware. It's the reason they're sending a final payload is they're going after or trying to, in these cases, some sort of Linux-based networking device or consumer device.
yep,
So I feel like one of the big takeaways in this whole top volume section is it really shows the difference between the first stage of malware or staging compared to endpoint. And in the cases when there are actual threats, it's because it's targeting network devices often, or it's doing something for network traffic, which might be the last threat you're going to talk about.
yeah, and that last one in the list, the application.proxy.otn, actually showed up both in our top by volume and our top by encrypted malware as well too. It's a type of like evasive loader that can help proxy traffic, but really it also facilitates communication over like covert channels too, often using encryption. Attackers will use tools like this to like infect one device and then proxy their activity through that device to say make it come from somewhere local within the country or from like a residential IP address instead of a cloud IP address. All different ways to evade detection as they go and attack other organizations too. Corey, you want to take
Absolutely.
over to talk about the most widespread threats?
Yeah, and the most widespread, like Mark mentioned, the ones by volume are purely raw volume, what just got detected the most. But it could be 5 boxes in one region detecting it 1,000 times. So that doesn't necessarily mean it hit many customers, even though it's high volume. In the top widespread malware, what we do is look at the malware that's hitting the most number of fireboxes. So really the ones that are widespread. So some of the things we see is first, two of these are exploits, the exploit math type and the one that shows a CV 2017 blah, blah, blah. Both of those are actually Office targeted vulnerabilities. And by the way, even the one called math type was a vulnerability found in 2017 as well. So they're both old Microsoft Office related vulnerabilities that essentially allow attackers who haven't patched Office in, what is that, 9 years? Seems crazy that people wouldn't patch, but people that are running very old versions, if they got any sort of Word, PowerPoint, even RTF, especially I believe the second one targeted RTF files, and opened them, it would execute code and then install some sort of malware after. In both the top encrypted and in top widespread, we share a little more geographic detail. So it is kind of interesting to see the math type one was a lot in Greece, Germany, and EMEA devices were quite exposed compared to other regions of the world. Whereas, and the other one was EMEA as well, but different countries like Poland, Turkey, and Greece. Uh, Next, or in between those two, was the heuristic detection for a midsize. A heuristic detection just basically means instead of a specific pattern to catch one thing, it's a set of kind of heuristic rules, hopefully designed to catch a family, even of variants of the one thing. And in this case, the thing it's catching is something called the Zard or smoke loader family, depending on what researcher you look at. And these are basically modular remote access Trojans. They're a backdoor that gets on your computer that's designed to be a remote access Trojan that a bad guy can bounce off. They can use it to install additional malware payloads. They often can use it to manually steal information, turn your device into proxy, do a lot of different things. The modular part means that sometimes the main malware you get at first is the remote access Trojan, the backdoor, but they can load additional modules depending on what they actually want to do with it. The final two things, Zmutzi is something I won't describe much. It is a Trojan as well. It's one that's been in many of our reports. We've gone into detail before, so it's not surprising to see Smutzi again in fourth place. And the final one, Adware Krios, is what it sounds like. It is a adware threat that has heavily been passing through malvertising. So, you might go to a site that has paid advertising, but if a malvertiser can get malicious ads there, it can spread other things like adware that helps it spread its malicious advertising campaign. So that's what the widespread look like. I will, just for the sake of it, I keep on going to the report. I do want to encourage you, everything we're talking about is only a fraction of what's in the report. So if you're interested in a lot of details, check it out. One of the details we don't really put in this is kind of regional distribution of malware and network attacks. And some of the interesting things we talk about is most of the malware is happening in the APAC region. EMEA gets less, and the Americas is right in between. And we have the same for network attacks. So be sure to check out the report as well. But with that, why don't we transition to network attacks, Mark?
Yeah. So when we look at network attacks compared to the first half of the year, it was actually down just slightly to about 845 detections per firebox. And Corey, you're still showing the report if you don't mind pivoting back to the slides for it. But
Give me, I
perfect.
definitely see you, but are you seeing the right thing?
It was there for a second. But while Corey's pulling that up, so one trend that remains every period we look at in the report is when we're seeing network attack detections, it's almost overwhelmingly automated tools. Attackers will use some automated scanner to go find and automatically exploit exposed vulnerabilities across the internet, which means we see a lot of both just generic types of detections as they go after common categories of web application flaws, as well as lots of old vulnerabilities that were widely exposed when they first came out. I think after proxy logon, the vulnerability in Microsoft Exchange Server came out back in 2021, that exploded to the top of our list, and it's still there at number 10, even after all of this time, because many organizations just don't do a great job at staying up to date on patching their exposed services. But even beyond just these automated scanners, all internet exposed systems are just constantly monitored. There are tools out there like Census and Shodan where they can find and quickly fingerprint every single public IP regularly on an ongoing basis. Even as new systems are spun up, it's often just minutes and sometimes seconds before they are identified, fingerprinted, and loaded into a database. And even if those systems aren't vulnerable to something right now, there is a database that knows exactly what's running on them, exactly what version it is. And so as soon as a one-day vulnerability pops up, something that is potentially patched but disclosed, attackers will immediately go to these databases and these tools to go find systems that don't immediately patch and go start popping them left and right, which is why it's critical to make sure that you're keeping an eye on what you have exposed to the internet. But when we look at the top 10 network attacks for 2020, the second half of 2025, there actually weren't any new additions to the top 10 when compared to previous periods. All of them were returnees from either the first half of last year or maybe quarter four of 2024. You'll see it's heavily weighted towards common web app flaws, where about half the detections are actually just generic signatures designed to catch common categories of web application vulnerabilities, like cross-site scripting attempts, or even SQL injection. And what year is it? It's 2026 right now, and we're still seeing SQL injection vulnerabilities both being exposed and being exploited out there on the internet. Now, directory traversal, so trying to escape out of these safe web directories and maybe access other sensitive files on the server itself, including one specific but generic signature for catching someone trying to access the password file from Linux servers as well. So we aren't surprised to see these types of signatures in the top 10 list because they're just generic to catch common flaws regardless of what application it is. But it's clear that attackers are heavily probing for common categories and classes of vulnerabilities across internet exposed web services. In the report, we go beyond the top 10. We actually look at new additions to the top 50 to just see what emerging threats are attackers going after. A couple of main takeaways from there. There was a denial of service vulnerability that Apache patched in their web application or their web server way back in 2012, so almost a decade and a half ago. We saw that pop in the top 50 for the first time ever, almost entirely affecting systems in the United States, which is really interesting. And then one other interesting one, there's a development framework called Telerik for if you're making a web application and you don't want to code all of the web front end yourself. You can use a framework like Telerik, in this case, specifically for ASP.NET, which is a type of programming language for web applications. They had a pretty serious vulnerability back in 2017, and we saw that pop into the top 50 for the first time, and this time almost overwhelmingly in France specifically. So interesting seeing how some of these attacks are targeted towards specific regions. Sometimes maybe it's a threat actor trying to just go after organizations in that region specifically. Sometimes it's going after certain languages or potential victims out there too. But at least compared first half to the second half of the year, Corey, we lost your slides there for a second. Interesting seeing a bit of a dip in just overall detections, but still a focus on the same categories of flaws that we see quarter after quarter. But that, Corey, if you want to reshare, and then we can go into the DNS watch section.
I was going to, sorry, that was me actually locking my laptop and having to authenticate with MFA. What I was trying to get to, by the way, while you were talking, was the part of the report where you mentioned some stuff regionally about one attack. But I do think it's interesting that for malware, APAC was the region, but it's a direct opposite for network attacks. The US was where we saw most network attacks. So that was quite interesting to me. One other thing, if I can get to the right thing, I did want to point out, and I want to see if you agree with this. This is not planned between me and Mark, but I find the shellcode NOP sled interesting in our top attacks. That is something that actually detects exploit like shellcode, the end part of an exploit. And often when you're doing some sort of memory-based corruption, a buffer overflow, for instance, you have control of some memory, but you, as an attacker, need to find how you can get to the right execution pointer to actually execute code. And often they do no operation sleds, which means Once they know where that register is, they do a certain amount of no operation repeatedly until they get to that register. The reason I bring up this one is to kind of give a random tip. All the other IPS triggers are us blocking an attack. We've blocked a known attack with a signature. My suggestion is not always. Sometimes the shellcode is in the attempt to before an exploit exists. But if you're getting something that is detecting shellcode, it's possible that the exploit worked enough to start delivering something. And in this case, IPS is still doing a neat thing of actually blocking the exploitation of the shellcode, maybe, depending on how the shellcode's delivered. It could have been delivered as part of a file where it saw it before the exploit worked. But the main takeaway is you might want to have some sort of rule triggering on that particular signature to go back and make sure, nothing actually succeeded that caused that NOP sled to trigger. So just a thought I had, Mark. Don't know if you agree.
Yeah, always.
Cool. With that, as Mark mentioned, the last section to the Firebox feed, the non-endpoint stuff, is something Mark writes on DNS Watch, our domain or DNS firewall, which looks at malicious domains. We used to do basically the top 10 threats for compromised sites, for malicious sites, and for command and control stuff, if I remember. Oh, phishing too. But those started to have the same threats. So instead, in this section, Mark outlines a couple of domains that were delivering specific malware. One of the ones that we saw over and over again was delivering Remcos, which is a remote access Trojan that's kind of sold as malware as a service. What we were seeing happening is a domain SMS-SZFang, don't go to that, on October, showed up and was quickly generating thousands, almost 3,000 detections, primarily in Japan. Oh, actually, that's Redline. In this case, it was a different domain, was malware neng.top, don't go there, was hosting malicious PowerShell that acted as a stager. And when Mark looked into how that malicious PowerShell happened, what he found out was one example of it. It really was starting as a malicious phishing email campaign that was sending typical invoice emails that you might see as fake spoofed emails to get you to do something. In this case, it was coming from a popular air compression manufacturer. But that email included an attachment. As you can see by the icon, the attachment looked like a Word document and partially had docx in it. But if you look closely, the Word attachment that was showing the right icon was actually a .js or a piece of JavaScript. If you ran that JavaScript, or first looking at that JavaScript, it was heavily obfuscated. You probably can't see this well in the slide, but there's a screenshot in the report. It looks like a bunch of gibberish words. Like it looks like a bunch of words that aren't even in English, but really this is an obfuscation. The part of the JavaScript code was changing that. I believe base 64 encoding was involved into real JavaScript that was actually malicious and ran. This simple type of obfuscation is a good way to get past crappy security tools that don't look for obfuscation. But when the JavaScript ran, it actually would use malicious PowerShell, and it would actually go to this particular site. The site would deliver malicious PowerShell, which it would run locally, and then that PowerShell would download and install this very popular Remcos remote access Trojan, which would, of course, give someone backdoor access and allow them to do a lot of stuff. So just an interesting take on an attack. You're probably used to these types of invoice emails, and you probably know that Word documents can be malicious. For example, we mentioned Word and RTF in the top widespread malware, so be careful for that and make sure your users are trained. The other one, which I started describing, was that domain SMS-SZFang, and this showed up on October 12th and was getting a lot of hits. And primarily in Japan for this one, this domain was hosting the second stage for these red line stealer attacks, which is a type of info stealer malware that is sold as malware as a service, so anyone can get it. It would start with a fake a software update that was adding other locations. So from another place, you might get some sort of fake software update. but that fake software update would actually go to this domain, download the Redline malware. And as you can guess, a Redline stealer is an info stealer. It will take sensitive information from your computer. For instance, it will take credentials or maybe cookies even stored in your web browser to try to log in as you. It will look for any cryptocurrency wallets. It often gets system information just to learn more about you and your system. And of course, almost every type of malware, even if it's just an info stealer, will have a module that will allow it to download and install additional payloads too. So it could be anything. And the most interesting thing about this is, besides being hosted in Japan, all of the file names for this campaign were in Japanese, which heavily suggests that these were directly targeted attacks in Japan, or maybe watering hole attacks that were targeting Japanese folks. So let's get into the Firebox defense tips. What can you learn from these? Starting with the first one, Mark.
Yeah, so first off, if you're not inspecting encrypted web traffic at your perimeter, you're missing the majority of attacks that are out there. It was something like 96% of malware we saw arrived over an encrypted channel. That is a sizable portion of malware threats to be allowing through just because you're not inspecting traffic. And still only around like 20% or so of WatchGuard customers actually go through the effort of setting up HTTPS decryption on their Firebox appliances. And I get it, it's because it takes a little bit of time. You have to do a certificate management within your organization, but that time gives you a massive return on investment in terms of identifying and blocking threats. If you're a mobile user or primarily mobile organization, FireCloud from WatchGuard is another great option for this. It actually takes care of that certificate management for you and performs HTTPS decryption within our points of presence and applies all those layers of anti-malware as well too, without you having to do anything at all, which is another great way to catch threats at the network layer before it even reaches the endpoint as well. Because while you hopefully, if you're listening to this webinar, have layers of security to protect you, you don't want to rely on just a single layer on the endpoint, like endpoint protection or even EDR, because nothing is perfect out there. And attackers can potentially find ways to bypass some other protections too, which is why these layers of protection are so important. So if you aren't already inspecting network traffic at the perimeter, make sure you pencil out some time to go get that set up with your organization.
And I always like to point out that this is free, by the way. There's a lot of security services and add-ons that you have to get licenses for with our product, but our TLS decryption is a free function that comes with the base Firebox. So other than setting up, there's no reason not to use it. But to Mark's point, the next tip, we are getting sick of finding ways to say you should keep old stuff patched and new stuff patched. You need to patch your software, keep all of your software. And by the way, hardware has software too. So this includes firmware. Keep all of that updated very regularly. But in this case, to say patch in a little different way, we want you to focus on internet-facing web applications. And you can kind of see that based on Mark's description of what we see in the top network attacks. Whether it's good guys, people like Census and Shodan that are constantly mapping publicly facing internet services and what they are on the internet, or bad guys using botnets to constantly just mass scan every IP address on the internet and automate. They're probably even more noisy. If they see port 80 open, they probably don't even enumerate what's running on it. They just exploit every single one of their HTTP port 80 vulnerabilities. Whether it's bad guys or good guys, if it's public on the internet, it's getting hit every day. People are looking for it. So patching can be a struggle if you have a big organization, you have hybrid situations, cloud, containers, all that jazz. But a simple tip is prioritize this internet-facing stuff. All of us have stuff that we have hidden in our internal network. We might have a demilitarized zone, which is your second priority, but all of us do have stuff where we're exposing at least a website or an email server or something to the internet itself. Patching is super important. You all know that. You're sick of us saying it. But if you have problems staying up to date with patches, absolutely prioritize those internet facing, and in this case, web applications specifically, because the web is definitely the battleground as far as what we see in our top network attacks. And you can finish us off, Mark, on, or
And
at
then
least for
finally,
Firebox.
yeah, make sure you're blocking JavaScript in emails. Like that Remcoast malware as a service remote access Trojan Corey talked about was primarily delivered as a JavaScript payload attached to an email, sometimes in a zip archive, but always JavaScript to start it off. And there is no legitimate reason to be sending JavaScript attached to emails. Like even if you think you have a legitimate reason, maybe you're in a role like us as a security practitioner, or
Developer?
you want to share something to go, like, I don't know, work with another employee. You don't want to build that
Precedent.
exactly the precedent of people trusting JavaScript attached to emails. Like use some other file sharing service to do that. So make sure you've got like an email security tool or just directly on your MTA, like block JavaScript as email attachments, because it is a popular attack vector for threat actors. And make sure also on the back end, your EDR tools are capable of detecting and blocking malicious JavaScript too, just as that additional layer of protection. But if you can just neuter an entire capability for threat actors by blocking it, because there's no legitimate purpose, you can help set yourself up to focus on bigger fish out there as well too. So with
And while we're
that,
talking about this
yeah,
tip, you can also block executables from email and make sure that you have our settings turned on to inspect inside zip files and even multiple layers of compression. Because if you're blocking JavaScript, you want to be sure that your scanning tool can see inside compression to find the JavaScript in it.
exactly.
But with that, we can transition to now let's talk about the endpoint view. As Mark said earlier, this comes primarily from WatchGuard EPP and APDR software, as well as some of our legacy AD360, which is essentially the same product, but the previous version of it. So we'll start with the high-level trends. If I were to summarize the network malware trends, we saw a big increase in volume, but we saw a lowering in sophistication. And I say sophistication because we saw less zero-day malware. Most of what we detected was stuff that we could catch with basic, good old signature-based gateway antivirus. I will say there was some evasion, as Mark mentioned, because we did see malware using encryption channels. But overall, less evasive, sophisticated malware, lots of volume. The endpoint story is almost the exact opposite. Now, the way we measure, because we only can get smaller subsets of data, we literally protect over 7 million clients out there, 7 million endpoints. But we only look at a subset of data statistically of it. But one of the things we look at is total malware threats. So this is kind of the equivalent of what's the volume of malware saying. However, there is one difference. This isn't real volume because every hash, every single exact file that we block counts as one. So if we do see the exact same file hundreds of thousands of times across many endpoints, that still counts as one. So it's a combination of every specific unique piece of malware we've seen, whether it's new or whether it's old. So it's not directly volume, but it is the closest we have to volume in the endpoint side. In general, while volume of malware total threats did increase a bit at the beginning of the first half of the second half of last year in Q3, it then dropped precipitously very low. So even combined, the volume of total malware dropped quite a bit. But what was interesting of that total malware, most of it was brand new, never before seen unique threats. So the other thing we look at in the same way is what is new malware? Again, even if we see one hash a million times, we only count it as one. So it could actually be huge volume numbers, but it's one new hash, one new threat. This blew up in Q4 as the total malware was dropping. The thing that was going up was of that total malware, it was mostly new stuff. So I would say the harder to detect new stuff showed up more in the endpoint section of the report for us. And next year we'll have better comparison half over half in this section. We try to show all quarters to start to get that comparison. The other thing, we look at tons of stuff in the endpoint section. We only show a fraction of it in this webinar, but there's so many different ways that our endpoints detect malware. A lot of them happen locally, a set of local signatures, heuristic rules, some indicators of attack, process injection, lots of exploit detection. But then there's also when something is not fully known to be good or bad 100%, we submit it to the cloud, and then it goes through a cloud set of signatures, which is a huge set of signatures and rules. It goes things through many layers of AI machine learning models to detect it more proactively. It can go through a behavioral sandbox. And at the end of the day, if it goes through all of that, and say we think it might be a threat, but we're only 70% confident, we don't know for sure, it will land in what we call manual attestation, which is actually a human's hands with a very quick turnaround SLA, because we have to deliver this quickly for you for our zero trust application service. But it will go to a human to make that final decision. By the way, only a tiny fraction of threats tend to go to the humans. But this section of the report shows you what part of our endpoint detection technology caught stuff. And there are some graphs that might illustrate this better, but the main takeaway is a lot of the threats for the second half of the year, which is the stuff highlighted yellow, even more so than the first half, was behavioral and machine learning. This is kind of our equivalent of the zero-day malware in the network section, because behavioral-based detection and machine learning or AI are the two proactive techniques where without humans, you can detect brand new, never be seen malware very, very quickly. So while zero-day malware was down quite a bit for network, a lot of our detections were based on these proactive technologies. Besides that, the cloud. When we say the cloud, that is essentially a huge list of hashes. We, of course, have signatures running locally, but for performance and all those reasons, there's only so many. So when we submit to the cloud, it gets our huge 30-year history of this stuff. A lot of detections were made there, and we're getting a significant, while it's still, when you look at the actual percentage of files that get there, there is a lot of manual attestation at the end of the day happening. So the main takeaway I have from this is we always will need some level of signatures and rules to catch the noise and the easy stuff, but you really need that proactive behavioral and AI-based malware detection, whether we're talking network or endpoint threats. I'll hand it off to Marc to talk about how malware starts on a machine, though.
Yeah, one of the other things we look at in the report every period is what is the technique that the attacker used to kick off that malware threat or the endpoint threat? Did they use a script? Did they exploit an application? Did they just use something built into Windows? Like there's a bunch of different avenues for an attacker starting an attack against an endpoint. And when we look at like Q3 versus Q4, even compared to previous quarters, there's a lot of similarity, but there's a few standouts in here where malware starting with a script. So like that JavaScript based one that we just talked about in the DNS watch section, or a PowerShell script, sometimes VB script in a Word document, that actually dropped slightly just towards the end of the last year, coming down from 36% to just 17% of all the threats we detected on the endpoint. Meanwhile, Windows binaries, so the applications built into Windows, went up from around 24% to 39%. But even as those kind of seesawed back and forth, the main takeaway was the majority of attacks started with living off the land techniques. Yeah. So using these scripting engines or the applications built into Windows to start that first bit of the attack. And we'll talk a bit more about that in the defensive takeaways too.
I do want to highlight, by the way, the Windows change. It like Marc says, we consider both scripts and Windows. They don't always 100% represent living off the land attacks, but both of those are heavy indicators. The Windows one, because it's a legitimate binary being misused, and scripts because it's PowerShell or VB script. But this is, to give you some historical context, 2 years ago, scripts represented 90%. Like it was everything. Windows was something like 8%, and some of these other things Mark are going to get into were in the single digits or less. So first of all, over the last 2 years, scripts have gone from being 90% of this down to less. But I do find it very interesting that for the first time, even though they both represent living off the land attacks, this is the first time Windows binaries has been #1 in the history of our report. So uh, both those things, I mean, as Mark said, this is Q3 and Q4, so it's all in the half, but really that Windows change happened at the end of the year. So I just find it interesting.
Yep. When we look at some of those other things though, like web browsers, it held steady at around 14%, which is still way more than it used to be even just like 2 years ago. And I think Chrome specifically was 80% of that in total, which I guess kind of makes sense. Chrome has the largest market share of all the browsers. It makes sense why it would have the largest market share of all of the attacks against browsers too. But the main takeaway from this, like Corey said, is that living off the land is massively popular from attackers. They're transitioning away from like building and bringing their own tools to just using the stuff that's available, because that is almost impossible to detect with traditional anti-malware services, and where EDR becomes that fundamental requirement for defending an endpoint. But speaking
One
of
last little
defending,
ad hoc thing
yeah,
is other. Other contains a lot of stuff, but the one I always remember that Ryan mentions in his section is the auto KMS software. So the auto KMS is really Windows piracy software that tries to get you to uses a malicious server to activate your Windows installs. So other has a lot of stuff. The report will share more detail if you're interested, but do know some of other is related to downloading piracy related or cracking tools and software.
good thing no one does that on a business network.
Yeah, and it never happened. So there's certainly no security team that would catch that accidentally.
Anyways, you want to round us out, Corey, with our final defensive tips?
Yeah, the first tip I can probably go through really quickly because I think you covered it well, but we just have to talk about it because it's a common theme. Whether it's the almost the entire web is encrypted. Let's face it. I'm sure the number is probably 97%, and there's probably like 12 mom and pop sites that still use HTTP. But 90% of your day, you're doing stuff over an encrypted web connection. Any SaaS application you use, which is every business is probably in SaaS applications all day, that's encrypted web traffic. If you're not doing something to look into that and apply the security services into that, you only have partial security. Now, as Mark mentioned in the endpoint section, there's endpoint products can help. Like when it gets to our endpoint product, it's decrypted so we can do something. But even though we have very effective tools, very cool tools with our zero trust application service that really do catch a lot, nothing is infallible. Nothing will ever be perfect. If there's a security vendor that will tell you they will block everything no matter what, run fast because they're liars. It's impossible to be infallible. So we heavily recommend you do something to make sure to look into encrypted traffic on a network level too. The Firebox can do that. As Mark mentioned, a very cool new, kind of SASE solution is FireCloud, which offers both, firewall as a service that will automatically take care of that encrypted portion of traffic for you when it does malware and network encryption. So definitely find a way to do encrypted traffic, and no matter what, still have the endpoint controls that can see the traffic once it's decrypted anyways.
Yeah. And like we were just talking about for the second tip, attackers are moving away from bringing their own tools. It's no longer like the early 2000s where it was ransomware.exe attached to an email that or downloaded directly from a website. Now they are starting and almost entirely using just living off the land techniques, where they're taking the legitimate applications that come with Windows or Linux or Mac OS, and they could do almost all, if not all of the bad stuff using just those tools. Which means if you're not watching for malicious activity coming from legitimate tools, you're going to miss all of that on the endpoint. The EDR is the table stakes now, where you're not going to catch traditional living off the land with your McAfee or whatever endpoint security, just the traditional legacy stuff on the endpoint. You want to pair that though with restricting access to some of these really powerful tools on the endpoint. You probably don't need your typical user in accounting, well, maybe accounting, your typical user in marketing to have access to PowerShell, for example. So if you can restrict access to some of these powerful but legitimate tools, you can reduce the attacker's ability to abuse them if they compromise that endpoint.
And even if you
But
have to allow the access to the tool, there are configuration settings to, sometimes they can be defeated, but not all, where you can at least have policies and limit what the tools can do based on privilege and stuff like that. But at the end of
yeah,
the day,
and this
it's still cool to
is
have an EDR product that can actually watch the PowerShell executing for indicators of attack.
And this is where EDR and specifically where WatchGuard's EPDR can come in too, where we have specific indicators of attack and detection scenarios that look for people trying to circumvent some of those rules Corey just mentioned. So if you have your system properly hardened, paired with a good EDR tool to watch it, you stand a chance against these living off the land techniques. Corey, you want to grab the last one?
Yeah, the final one is a little soft, but it's security awareness. I mean, we live in a day and age where stuff is moving fast. We didn't even, a lot of the attacks were phishing. The Remco's attack started with the invoice email. I would say invoice emails are on the lowest spectrum of phishing. They're kind of the obvious thing that you probably are already training your users about. But nowadays we have deep fakes. We have emails that are super well written and targeted, and the AI is assisting in the targeting to make them even more enticing to a victim to think they're legitimate. Lots of the malware as a service. I mean, really, almost all malware nowadays, the person hacking you is probably using malware as a service, whether it's ransomware, whether it's their phishing kit, whatever it is. They're probably not technically savvy enough to develop that themselves. They can just get it on the underground for a cheap price or for free and just give some of their stolen goods to the person that makes it. And their job is more to socially engineer your users, to get your users to do things they shouldn't. And at the end of the day, maybe one day, maybe when it's AI versus AI, security makes better AI and we fix all the technical vulnerabilities. This won't happen, but let's hypothetically say it ever does. There's no technical vulnerabilities. We've fixed all those attacks, so there's nothing they could do. That way, technically, to just hijack a system, they would still be able to trick users to do things. So security awareness is a very important part of your security strategy. A lot of these technical threats we talk about really just start with very basic phishing emails, or in one case it was fake security software, a fake update for software. All of those are known techniques that if you at least train your users about, you can get them skeptical and maybe not clicking on things they shouldn't.
Yep.
So that's the tip, and that was the report. I haven't had a chance to look at questions. I would like to say thank you, everyone, and definitely come hear more about this if come to our blog Secplicity and listen to our podcast. But I'm going to stop sharing, and
Was
maybe we could look at questions.
one question that came in just asking where they can find the full security report. Liz tossed a direct link into the chat for everyone, but you can also just find it watchguard.com/security report. And it is up right now, including the executive summary too, if you don't want to read through a 45-page technical paper as well and just want the highlights. But didn't see any other questions pop in yet too, but maybe we can give everyone just a couple seconds to see if there's anything that came in. Meanwhile, Corey, like,
And thank you
what
for
do
the
you think
clapping
our
folks.
next report's going to be in? Like, all about the agentic threats starting to finally make an impact against organizations?
Yeah, I mean, tune into our podcast. I don't think for the past 4 months, there has not been like a week that's gone by where we weren't talking about both good defenses that AI brings, but also a lot of the new attack surface. AI is nascent enough that we're seeing a lot of new threats evolve quickly. And that doesn't mean AI is bad. In fact, I think the only solution is AI-based defenses. So yeah, maybe we'll see some agentic attacks. I have a feeling though our report catches the high, like it's hard to find the sophisticated needle in the haystack. Our report is very quantifiable. It's quantitative in that we get it from our products, but the highlights we show you is the stuff that rises to the top. The scariest stuff is that little silent one-off needle in the haystack, and that's what maybe our other reports, maybe our research projects will start to share that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, we
Oh,
are
it
up
does
on
look
time. I
there's
don't. Looks like
uh,
We see we currently have EPDR with WatchGuard. Would it block PowerShell by default, or can we set it? So by default, it doesn't block PowerShell entirely. It blocks malicious use of PowerShell, which is exactly what you want in that. You
It
can add a
specifically has
program blocking.
indicators of attack. So yeah, it specifically, Mark mentioned the indicators of attack, and I think I did too. So some examples are, it might look for some parameters in PowerShell where you try to disable its IPS and disable its group policy. It will look for obfuscation. So if it sees PowerShell run, but there's some there's something obfuscated, it will trigger an indicator of attack. It triggers on a lot of things that are known malicious things associated with PowerShell, but it won't, like, we're not going to outright block it unless, I mean, Mark is going to get into you can application whitelist everything if you wanted to with EPDR, and I think that's what you're going to share next.
There is a
right,
program blocking feature, so you can block it if you want on the endpoint. But EDR and EPDR's main use case in this scenario is to identify and block that malicious use of PowerShell on the endpoint.
I think it's good not to block it because there's not an administrator in the world. I mean, like Mark said, if you want to do it by department and role, that's a good idea. But by default, it's a little hard because it's PowerShell. It's in its name. It's a powerful tool for IT people. IT people love it too. I love it. It's just with that power comes responsibility. So I really like the indicators of attack and also things like the exploit detection. All kinds of living off the land attacks with Windows binaries where they're trying to inject legitimate processes to kind of hide their malware inside something legitimate. We have a lot of exploit detection to catch those injection techniques and things like that.
Cool. Well, I think at time, that's that. Thank you everyone for sticking around for this webinar, and we'll chat with you again in another 6 months with another fresh take at trends.